Alright, so I'm back going again live. I don't know what happened to the last one, but I will try doing this again, and I will try finishing it. Again, I will be saying a lot of the stuff I did say in the first one, and I will try not to stutter so much. So, here we go. Now I'm going to debunk Eric Dubay once again. You know, that same idiot who has never once studied science, but somehow thinks he can debunk all of science. Yeah, he's Dunning Kruger. All right, let's start.
The 10 things that all flat earthers say. Number one extremely problematic side effect of taking the globe and flattening it out into a plane is that gravity makes no sense, and there is no reason for things to fall to the ground.
Quite simply, objects fall or rise based on their relative density to the medium surrounding them. Apples fall because they are denser than the air, while helium balloons rise because they are lighter. No gravity necessary.
So we start off with failing to address Dave's point. What part of density does not produce a force of any kind do you morons not understand? If it was all due to density, everything would go up when you let it go, because that's where the less dense medium is. Gravity is the only way to explain the falling motion here on Earth. So if gravity existed on a flat Earth, standing towards the center would feel relatively normal. But as you go towards the edge, it would feel like you are climbing uphill because more mass is behind you. Gravity would not work on a flat Earth. But Dave's point was that we know that there is a force that pulls things down, and it's caused by the large mass of Earth. So we know that gravity is a real thing, and that kills flat Earth.
This is why raindrops fall down through the air, and air bubbles rise up through water. Everything seeks its relative density and rises or falls until settling accordingly. This is
But again, Eric, density is not a force. For things to move, they need a force. And what is that force? Gravity.
why a tiny pebble sinks to the bottom of the ocean, but gigantic cruise ships and aircraft carriers stay afloat on the surface. Because even though a pebble is so small, its mass relative to its volume, its density, is more than water, so it sinks. And even though a cruise ship is so large, its mass, relative to its volume, is less than water, so it floats. If Newton's apple had landed in a puddle instead of on his head, he would have seen the apple only fell through the air because it was denser than the air, but then floated on top of the water because it was less dense than water.
Well, no, because Newton never had an apple land on his head. That's just a story. He saw an apple land in a puddle, and he wondered why it went straight to the ground instead of sideways or upwards, and he figured out that in order for it to move, something has to cause it. You can't even get actual history correct.
Have you ever noticed how it's easier to stay afloat with your lungs full of air than it is when they're empty? Submarines float on the surface when their ballast tanks are filled with air, but when the vents are opened and seawater floods in, they begin to sink as the submarine's density becomes greater than water. Depending what depth they wish to dive, sailors simply adjust the ratio of air and water in their tanks, and when ready to resurface, they blow compressed air into the tanks, forcing the seawater out, lowering the density, and thus causing them to rise back to the surface.
It's because of buoyancy, and this is the equation for buoyancy. FB equals PGV. And what does the G stand for? Gravity. Nothing you say about relative density makes any sense. How do those objects know how to arrange themselves into a particular density gradient? You've given such a vague explanation.
We can also prove this fact of relative density by filling a balloon with approximately half helium and half air. Since helium is lighter than the oxygen, nitrogen, and other gases that compose the air around us, filling a balloon with just the right amount of helium to compensate for and balance out the density of the plastic results in a gravity-defying, levitating balloon at equilibrium that neither rises nor falls.
So basically, your entire thing here is, I don't know how this is happening, but I know it's not gravity. That's what we call an argument from incredulity.
All objects accelerate towards the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared. That's an indisputable fact.
Oh, is it an indisputable fact that feathers fall to the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared? Is it indisputable that dandelion seeds fall to the ground at that rate?
Yes, in a vacuum or on the moon, they absolutely would.
What about skydivers with an open parachute? What if we're falling through water? The rate at which things fall has everything to do with the relative densities between the object and medium, and has nothing to do with the fictional pulling force of gravity.
No, Eric, it has everything to do with gravity. Without gravity, there would be no reason for things to fall, nor would there be up and down. Nothing fictional about gravity. It's an observable fact.
Nor does the rate or manner in which objects fall have any bearing whatsoever on the shape of the Earth. But this type of sophistry is the kind of tacky glue that holds the whole heliocentric model together.
And it is also an indisputable fact that any acceleration requires a force to produce it. This is how cars drive, planes fly, people walk, cats jump. It's how literally all motion works. Most of you address this problem by simply listing two words, density and buoyancy. Well, I hate to break it to you guys, but these are not forces. Forces are vectors. They have a magnitude, which means a numerical amount, and a direction, which means they have to point somewhere. Density is simply mass per unit volume, or how much matter sits in a particular space. It doesn't point anywhere. And buoyancy is simply a measurement of an object's tendency to float. You say that objects fall down because they are more dense than the air below them. Why down? Why not up? Or sideways? When you let go of a ball, there is air all around it. How does it know to fall down? Also, objects fall down when they're in a vacuum, which means there is no air below them. What's happening there?
I could similarly ask you, if gravity is real and responsible for keeping all the world's buildings, oceans, and people stuck to the ground, then why does it have no effect on pulling down a simple children's balloon? Are helium balloons magical anti-gravity devices?
It's because of buoyancy, you moron. He literally just told you. Did you forget? Or are you just willfully ignoring his point just to regurgitate flurf crap like it means anything? Second, your ignorance of how this works isn't exactly a rebuttal. What you don't realize is that when you morons bring this up, you're failing to understand a really basic concept here, and that is that more mass means a greater gravitational attraction, i.e., the denser the object, the more the gravitational force acts on it. Helium balloons are so light that there is no gravitational force acting on it, making it go up because it's lighter than the air, and because of gravity pulling down the more dense air with more force than the helium balloon, causing an upward force in the opposite direction, whereas buildings and oceans have so much mass that there is so much gravitational force acting on it. It's really not that hard to understand.
No. We live in a density gradient, and since the combination of plastic and helium present in the balloon is less dense than the nitrogen, oxygen, carbon, and other elements in the air around it, it rises. Likewise, if I release the helium and then blow up the balloon again, the magical anti-gravity properties disappear because now it is denser than the air around it. But wait, I thought Professor Dave, he's not really a professor. Cool story though, bro. I thought not a Professor Dave.
Wow, Eric, I bet you think you're so cool calling him not a Professor Dave, don't you? Just watch his video, Am I Really a Professor? And he basically goes through his teaching experience. You don't have to be in a college to be a professor. You do realize that, right? So, he is a professor, and surprise, surprise, you're wrong again.
Said that it's an indisputable fact that all objects fall to the ground at 9.8 meters per second squared. Why doesn't a balloon filled with carbon dioxide fall at this indisputable rate? Gravity is clearly racist against balloons, feathers, and other objects with relative densities near that of the medium surrounding them. Huh, Dave?
Wow, Eric. No, Eric, gravity is not racist. I'll have to admit that was clever, but still a stupid thing to say. Again, more mass means a greater gravitational attraction. That answers all your questions.
So again, to answer your question, objects are not tending towards the Earth. They are tending towards their density equilibrium. The least dense gases...
Why, Eric? Why? What tells the object to rise or fall? Why does it go to the ground instead of in the air? That doesn't answer his question at all. so it magically goes towards a more dense medium with nothing pulling down on its mass. Also, if it was all due to density, wouldn't it make more sense that things go up when you let them go, since that's where the less dense air is? What about the fact that objects can't accelerate without a force to produce it, which is what this whole thing was about? You've made no attempt to address Dave's point or explain anything here. You just say density and leave it at that.
Rise highest, while the most dense solids fall lowest. Here on Earth, so much solid matter has piled up in the dense direction that we actually have a platform to walk upon. But we are not yet at our density equilibrium, so we are constantly pushing downwards. Just as a helium balloon that rises and hits a ceiling has not yet reached its density equilibrium, and so it constantly pushes upwards on the ceiling.
And since density is not a force, you have no explanation for any of that, nor is your response to this nearly as thorough as you think. Also, how do those objects know which way is up and which way is down? Also, if you're going to claim it's due to their weight, how is it possible for them to weigh anything if nothing is pulling down on its mass? None of it makes any sense, when in actuality, gravity explains our observations flawlessly. It explains how objects know which way is up and which way is down. So basically, you are only left with two options here, Eric. One, the upward acceleration, which, despite its countless flaws, explains the falling motion. Or two, arguing that density doesn't do what we know it to do. Or gravity doesn't do what we know it to do, sorry. Those would be more realistic claims, that's all I'm saying. This whole density and buoyancy is just a bunch of conjecture.
Number 2. Flat earthers all say, I shouldn't see this thing, but I do, so the earth is flat. Then to justify this claim, you all say the same thing, typically with no context whatsoever. 8 inches per mile squared. None of you have any idea what this means. You can't derive it. You can't calculate anything with it. You can't make a prediction with it. You can't tell me anything about this value at all. When I point this out to you, you get very angry, and instead of answering simple questions, you just link me to a bunch of videos made by conmen. 8 inches per mile squared is not a valid way to measure Earth's curvature. If you understood math, you would immediately see that this squared on miles is totally out of place. That's because this is a parabolic approximation. This is for doing calculations with a parabola. It's possible that you remember this shape from middle school algebra, but I wouldn't be surprised if you don't. As you can see, the Earth is not shaped like this. So where does it come from, and why do people use it?
To begin with, the curvature formulas and curvature calculators that exist for the globe model were created by you globe Earth proponents, not us flat earthers. We are simply using the figures and formulas that you yourselves claim as representing reality and proving through easily observable, demonstrable, repeatable results that the alleged curvature does not exist.
Well, no, Eric. The 8 inches per mile squared formula did come from a Flurf, Samuel Robotham. He saw this parabolic equation in a surveyor's manual under the title Level. Surveyors use it as an approximation for small-scale measurements. But Robotham basically took it and ran with it and told everyone that we should be seeing a curve of 8 inches per mile squared, and here we are today with you flat earth sheep mindlessly going, where's the 8 inches per mile squared? Bah! Like it means anything. The correct equation is h equals r minus 1 cos A, and that is accurate for any measurement.
Non-Professor Dave tries to belittle flat earthers for using the parabolic 8 inches per mile squared approximation, but then refuses to mention the fact that this formula gives the same results as the more complicated trigonometrical formula for up to 300 miles.
No, it does not give an exact number. It gives an approximation that gets progressively less accurate the more you use it.
Which is far longer than anyone needs for practical curvature observations. The fact that observers at sea level on clear days can see islands, buildings, and mountains, often over 50 to 100 miles away, completely destroys the assertion that we live on a ball 25,000 miles in circumference.
Sorry, Eric, that's dead wrong. There are plenty of ways to disprove that notion, but I'll use this one. We have an atmosphere that causes refraction of light. This can allow objects that are below the physical curve of the Earth to appear higher than they actually are, meaning that you can see further than the physical horizon. 50 miles is less than 1 degree of the arc of the curve of the Earth, meaning that light doesn't really have to bend that much due to refraction, making it reasonable that we see things that far away. It's not surprising that you cherry-pick this argument, because this is just going to be another example in this video of you ignoring Dave's point entirely and repeating the original point that he already debunked. It's a perfect example of laziness that will be demonstrated many more times throughout this video.
Regardless of which curvature formula or curvature calculator used, You can even check the Metabunk or other globe apologist sites, input the figures, and see that these simple observations are in complete defiance of the globe's math.
Okay, I challenge any flat earther to show us one single observation that cannot be explained by the Metabunk calculator. They've been used countless times to disprove flat earthers' claims of seeing too far.
Number 3, all flat earthers say the same two things about water. The first is, water doesn't curve, and the second is, water finds its own level. The second phrase is completely meaningless, so the fact that you all say that exact thing verbatim is just one of the many demonstrations that you all blindly repeat what you hear without giving it a moment's thought. As for the first phrase, stating that water doesn't curve is at least a coherent thought. However, it is dead wrong. Put a drop of water on a piece of wax paper or a leaf. What does it look like? A freaking sphere. Isn't that something? In your haste to mindlessly parrot what you heard from flat earth priests about water, you forgot to look at water. Water curves, my friends. Look at this curved meniscus. Look at these waves. Water curves all the time.
Holy snarky strawman, Batman. Not really a Professor Dave is stooping to new levels of sarcastic sophistry. Let me try doing this with that condescending cadence he delivers so naturally. Well, Dave, water most certainly does find its own level, and that's why water has been used as the #1 most accurate leveling tool for thousands upon thousands of years. Water does not have the ability to stay piled upon itself, so it will always flow outwards towards the lowest uncontained point. Once contained, the surface of undisturbed water will always remain level, with no deviation in elevation from one point to any other.
Holy cringy try-hard, Batman. Eric Dubay is trying so hard to talk down to someone who's got way more education than he'll ever get. So let me try doing this in his whiny, monotone voice he delivers so naturally. No, Eric, water most certainly does not find its own level. Water is not a living thing. It doesn't find anything. Level and flat are not synonymous, you idiot. Level means to have no part higher than another, meaning to balance something out. That concept literally only works because gravity exists. So you can have something that's level but not flat, and something that's flat but not level. Do you understand the difference now? I don't understand why you think level and flat mean the same thing. They don't. So thank you for misusing the word level and contradicting yourself. As you can see, the word level alone destroys flat Earth entirely, as it only works because gravity exists, and gravity wouldn't work on a flat Earth.
As for the straw man, water doesn't curve. Dave has conveniently shortened this to suit him.
Did you say straw man, water doesn't curve? I think you misspoke there, man.
His narrative. When he
Go
should
back
have
a
curve, Dave has convenient. As for the straw man, water doesn't curve.
I think you kind of messed up there, man.
Dave has conveniently shortened this to suit his narrative, when he should have said, large bodies of water at rest do not curve. The claim is large bodies of water sticking to and curving around a ball, not a single drop of water beating. That is a false equivalency and a straw man. We are not talking about the beating of a single drop of water, nor the meniscus in a glass of water, nor static electricity bending running water towards a comb. So any of these sophist examples put forth trying to prove curved water do nothing but show the desperation of these pseudoscientists to come up with such red herrings.
No, Eric, water curving is neither a false equivalency nor a straw man. That's water's natural state when it rests. Also, when liquids are undisturbed, i.e. have no forces acting on them, they form a sphere. You can call me indoctrinator for pointing this out, but might I add that we objectively have real images of seawater curving, i.e. NASA images, all of which you will claim are CGI, but you can never get off your lazy ass and provide anything in the way of proof other than saying they're obviously CGI because they look like CGI, and if you can't see it, you're too indoctrinated. And that's fine, but here's the problem. That is simply not good enough. You say they're obviously CGI, and you need to get off your lazy ass and prove it. In the skeptic community, we believe in empirical evidence. Not opinions or feelings, but empirical evidence. There's no legitimacy to saying something is obviously CGI if you've done nothing to prove it, which in this case you never do. Since you argue with no proof whatsoever, the burden of proof is on you here, Eric. So you can either provide empirical evidence all of them are CGI, or you can continue to make baseless claims that hold no water. It's your choice.
Number 4. You are all quite perplexed about how Earth's atmosphere can exist next to the vacuum of space. This one is rather amusing because what's happening is that since you have no science education, your only context for the word vacuum is a vacuum cleaner. And again, because you have no science education, none of you understand how a vacuum cleaner works, which is a problem because you seem to think that outer space is a vacuum cleaner. Let's take a moment and clear this up. A vacuum is any region where there is no stuff. Here, there is stuff, like air. In space, there is no stuff, or at least very, very close to no stuff. Space is essentially empty. That's a vacuum. It is not a thing that sucks. Vacuums don't suck. Everyone say it with me together. Vacuums don't suck.
Thanks so much for educating us on the subtle nuances and intricacies of how sucking works, Dave. I'm sure we all agree you are uniquely well qualified for explaining this subject. Unfortunately, though, your sucky straw man explanation still has not provided demonstrable proof of how a positive pressure system like Earth's atmosphere can exist adjacent to a negative pressure system like space without a solid barrier between the two. Anytime two opposing pressure systems come together without some solid membrane separating them, an equilibrium is quickly achieved. Nobody except Dave is saying space should suck Earth's atmosphere like a vacuum cleaner. We are saying, show us a demonstration of two opposing pressure systems without any solid barrier between them that do not equilibrate. If you cannot demonstrate this, but wish to claim this only happens at a scale too large for you to recreate, that is wishful thinking, not science.
Now, wait a second, Eric. Hold on. Back up. First of all, it's not negative pressure. It's zero pressure. Not that that really matters that much. Second, that's completely taken out of context. Dave doesn't just say vacuums don't suck and leave it at that. He actually does go on to explain what he's talking about. Unsurprisingly, you deliberately cut his point short just to make it look like that was his explanation, and so you could make this argument seem more valid than it actually is. Aside from that, it's pretty obvious why you left that part out, because you know that he goes on to make a rock-solid claim, leaving nothing for you to argue. His actual explanation was this.
Earth's atmosphere displays a gradient because gravity exists. There's a lot of atmosphere right near the ground, and then as you rise, because fewer and fewer molecules will have enough kinetic energy to go so high, it gets thinner and thinner and thinner until there's none left. Then you're in space. It's that simple.
So, as you can see, he goes on to explain that there is no pressure directly against the vacuum of space, making it reasonable that space and the atmosphere coexist side by side without a solid barrier. So it's kind of dishonest of you to deliberately leave that part out, don't you think? Third, no, when you say it should equilibrate, you are saying that it should suck. How would space and Earth's atmosphere equilibrate? Also, you seem to be of the mindset that the atmosphere remains as thick against the vacuum of space as it is on the ground. Again, the atmosphere is in layers. There's the troposphere, the stratosphere, the mesosphere, the thermosphere, the exosphere, and it gets lighter and lighter until it becomes nothing. In this case, it's gravity holding the atmosphere to the Earth, keeping the most dense air near the ground and the less dense air the vacuum of space. Fourth, one thing you flat Earth window lickers need to understand is that just because something can't be demonstrated to your specific liking doesn't mean it's wishful thinking. The answer you are looking for but are unwilling to accept is gravity. Since you're choosing willfully to ignore the science behind his arguments, none of what you said here is even remotely relevant. So basically your response to this was to cherry pick the part you want to hear, take it out of context, and leave out the part you don't understand? That's a little bit lazy, don't you think, Eric? Low effort, man. 0 out of 10.
Number 5. One of your favorite little gotcha challenges is to request that we demonstrate how water can stick to a ball spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. The implication is that water and everything else should fly off of it like a child getting thrown from a merry-go-round. Well, it's very cute that you get overwhelmed by numbers with 4 digits in them, but in actuality, the Earth spins once per day. One time in 24 hours. Get on a merry-go-round and have someone push you one time around over 24 hours. Not a very thrilling ride, is it? The issue is that the Earth is really, really big. So if instead of using rotational velocity to describe a rotating body like a normal person, you try to use linear tangential velocity, you're going to get a pretty big number. But to be honest, it's still not really that big.
It seems you're the one getting overwhelmed by your own globe figures, Dave. The alleged speed at which your tilting, wobbling, spinning space testicle Earth is actually supposed to rotate at the equator is 1,039 miles per hour.
No, it's not rotating 1,039 miles per hour. As you did with all his other points, you completely ignored what he said. You don't measure rotation in miles per hour. You use an angular velocity, aka RPM. Its tangential velocity at the equator is 15 degrees per hour, and its angular velocity is at every point on the globe is 0.0069. Tangential velocity and angular velocity are two completely different things, you moron.
We are all well aware that this means one rotation per day. But thanks for continuing to speak to your audience like illiterate, petulant children and pretending we cannot understand such basic concepts.
Oh, cry me a river, Eric. You're acting like you can't handle any criticism. The audience he's actually talking to is you flat earth morons whose IQ can be measured on a scale of a donkey turd and not his regular audience. His regular audience is used to learning about things like organic chemistry, virology, biology, anatomy, cosmology, and the warping of spacetime. You flat earth sheep are illiterate, petulant children incapable of understanding such concepts. And it's easy to expose you as such when you say things like this.
To a ball, but wish to claim it only happens on a scale too large for you to recreate. That is no different from me claiming that unicorns exist, and when asked to show a single example of one, I cannot. But instead I say, unicorns do too exist, but they are macrocosmic invisible unicorns that cannot be observed. Invisible macrocosmic unicorns may exist in Dave's fantasy delusions, but if he cannot show a single demonstrable evidential example, it is by definition not scientific.
Hey, Eric, so again, just like his last point, you know what answer you are looking for but are unwilling to accept is gravity. Again, just like his last point, what you're choosing willfully to ignore here is the science behind his arguments. Can you think of any reason why we can't show you a practical demonstration of water curving around and sticking to a ball here on Earth? Here's a hint. It has to do with what gravity does. So your unicorn anecdote doesn't mean anything. And you know, I just realized that the way you dealt with this was kind of contradictory to point number 3. In point number 3, you demand that we need to show seawater curving, and that showing a small-scale example of water curving is not good enough. It's not a good enough demonstration, as it is too small. But then in this point, you insist that we show water curving around and sticking to a ball on a scale small enough to recreate. Yeah. So really all we have here is you whining about how condescending Dave is, but not addressing any of his points, cutting out parts where Dave explains what he's talking about, and regurgitating the original point that he already debunked. Let's see if you actually put some effort into what has been so far a sorry excuse for a debunk.
Number 6. Lots of you say that moonlight is cold. This is astonishing for a number of reasons. The first is that it is not related to any claim you could possibly be making in order to argue for a flat Earth. But the second, and much more important detail, is that it is the perfect demonstration of the fact that you have no clue how science works. Some flat Earth priest measured the temperature under the moonlight and then again under something providing shade. Wow, moonlight makes it colder. But does it? Shouldn't you add some element of control to your experiment? What's a control, you ask? You see, your measurement isn't evidence of anything. You now have to repeat the experiment when there is no moonlight to make sure that the moonlight was indeed the cause of the discrepancy in temperature. This is something you should have learned in middle school, but don't worry, I'll finish the experiment for you. Take the measurements again on a night with a new moon so that there is no moonlight. Look at that. You'll get the same result. So the moonlight absolutely wasn't the reason for the discrepancy in temperature.
There are countless videos proving moonlight to be colder than moonshade, including peer-reviewed published experiments like in the Lancet journal.
I'm sure you'll be citing at least one and providing a demonstrable, repeatable example, right?
People can perform their own research on this topic, but I have to point out the obvious flaw Dave seems to have overlooked while he was so busy talking down to his audience. Dave assumes we don't know what a control is and insists that doing the experiment on different days during different phases of the moon will give different temperatures. Yes, Dave, of course it will, because it's a different day. Control experiments must be done simultaneously for them to be able to control for anything. Redoing the experiment under different conditions on a different day is anything but a control.
That's not how that works at all. How do you know it's the moonlight causing the cooling effect if you don't do it on a night when the moon isn't there or in different phases? You just demonstrated that you don't know what a control is with that very sentence, you idiot.
Regardless, the experiment has been done countless times by different people with the same results. Moonlight, especially during the full moon, is colder than moonshade.
No, Eric, moonlight is not cold. This is a simple phenomenon called radiative cooling, where something open to the sky will radiate heat back into space quicker than something in the shade. The moon doesn't even produce its own light, and that is super easy to prove. If you zoom in on the moon when you see it during the day, it's all rock. Rocks don't produce light. Also, every light source itself is hot when you touch it. How exactly can light be cold if it's hot when you stand close to it? Out of all arguments flat earthers make, this has got to be the dumbest.
You did get one thing right, though, and that is that this, once again, has nothing to do with flat Earth. It's funny how desperate you are to come up with 10 things all flat earthers supposedly say, yet several of your examples are just random red herrings that have nothing to do with the shape of the Earth.
It's also funny how you morons go on about the second law of thermodynamics and how Earth's atmosphere and space violate it, but then you ignore the fact that cold moonlight, or cold light in general, violates the second law of thermodynamics. Moron.
Number 7. Many of you say some unintelligible nonsense about water flowing uphill, or that on the globe model, some rivers flow uphill. This one is so stupid that I genuinely can't believe any human could fall for it. You'll look at a globe and say that a river flows this way, and that this is somehow uphill, because you seem to think that up on the screen is some kind of universal up in space. Listen up, there is no up and down in space. This is not up, this is not down. To believe so would be as dumb as thinking that on Earth, whichever way you happen to be facing is north. No one on Earth is upside down, or on their side. Up on Earth is away from the surface of the Earth, no matter where you are on the Earth.
Here, and yet another example of globe earthers trying to make common sense sound like nonsense, we hear that up is not up and down is not down. People live stuck all around a ball Earth, but nobody is sideways or upside down.
Argument from ignorance.
Globe believers hate thinking about people being sideways or upside down on their silly ball, so they just claim there is no such thing as up or down to calm their fevered brains.
What you're saying is irrelevant, and you know it's irrelevant. That's why you strawman his arguments in order to sound so smart, because you know that rivers flow from elevation to sea level, neither of which change between the curvature of the Earth. So you know that elevation and sea level can't have anything to do with curvature. But you say it anyway. Are you actually going to try and make a scientific response to this? Or are you just going to continue to endlessly strawman his arguments? Because these idiotic ramblings of yours are about as unscientific as it gets.
But regardless of their internal mind games, their ball model has people stuck at any and all of 360-degree inclinations around the thing, which means people would by necessity be walking around sideways and upside down relative to one another.
Well, yes, Eric. As Dave explained, up and down is relative. Down is towards the center of gravity, and up is away from the center of gravity. And that's no problem, because we have demonstrated that gravity is a real thing. Up and down are not universal. But, as I expected, you have your thumb up your ass while he explains with crystal clarity why this is a stupid argument. But of course, you don't care how stupid any of your arguments are. You just hang on to them because you can't find any new arguments, don't you, Eric? I mean, are you even trying at this point?
Likewise, Earth's many hundreds of rivers are constantly flowing north, south, east, west, and every other intermediary direction simultaneously, some of which flow for hundreds of miles with only the slightest of change in elevation. An absolute impossibility on a globe of given proportions.
Okay, I can deconstruct the stupidity of this argument all day, but I'll just ask you this, Eric. You regularly strawman the concept of gravity, thinking that it works one direction universally, so you can whine incredulously about rivers flowing uphill, people in the southern hemisphere walking around upside down, and any other misleading nonsense. And of course, you know that that is not how gravity works, but rather that it pulls everything towards the center of Earth, which is its center of mass, and water can curve around and stick to it like a ball. Explain, specifically and scientifically, in terms of physics, why you believe this to be impossible. Don't use your stupid water doesn't curve, water finds its own level. Don't resort to your typical whining about gravity being so strong that it holds Earth's buildings and oceans clinging to the underside of the ball Earth, and so weak that it allows birds and insects to fly, as those are arguments that have not only been debunked 1,000 times over, but also fail to understand basic science. Good luck. If you can't answer this without using strawmans, reserve that this argument is so nonsensical and is a ridiculous falsehood that you push on your gullible viewers and hope that they're too lazy to research it for themselves.
Number 8. Many flat earthers remain dumbfounded by the idea that the Earth is slightly closer to the sun in winter than in summer. As I've said before, winter up north is summer down south, and vice versa. So your confusion is one of northern hemisphere narcissism, but it is also one of complete ignorance. Here's the Earth. Here's the light coming from the sun. Look at this portion. It hits the Earth straight on. Look at this portion. Because of the curvature of the Earth, the light hits the surface at an angle and is therefore distributed around a greater area. Same amount of heat distributed around a larger area, lower average temperature. This is absolutely trivial to understand.
Thanks, Dave. Nobody is dumbfounded or confused about these simple pseudoscientific claims you're making.
That's a lie. You are dumbfounded and confused, as you are probably about to demonstrate in the next few painfully slow sentences.
We're simply presenting the inconsistencies of your model to you in question form because we're used to thinking for ourselves and allowing others to think for themselves, rather than condescendingly talking down to everyone from a pedestal like you're some infallible superior being armed with objective truth. The question is simple. How can the globe model purport the sun to be approximately 3 million miles closer to Earth in January, when winter and colder temperatures are found all over the Earth, than in July, when Earth experiences its warmest temperatures?
Because in the grand scheme of things, that 3 million miles is nothing. It doesn't negate the energy the Earth receives as a whole that much.
Dave claims due to the ball Earth's tilt, different places receive different amounts of direct sunlight, and that is what produces the seasonal and temperature changes.
It does, and how are you going to mess this fundamental fact up?
This makes no sense, however, because if the sun's heat travels over 90 million miles to reach the ball Earth, how could a slight tilt, a mere few thousand miles maximum, negate the sun's 90 million mile journey, giving us simultaneous tropical summers and Antarctic winters? Ball believers also say the sun is 1 million times larger than the Earth, so regardless of how you tilt the globe, there will still be plenty of direct sunlight.
And there you go again, disregarding what he said entirely and pleading ignorance. This isn't you presenting the inconsistencies of our model to us in question format, like you're erroneously giving yourself credit for. This is you going, I don't understand, so you're wrong. If you were used to thinking for yourselves, then you would at least try and understand what he said and explain why you think he's wrong, instead of saying it's wrong because you don't understand it. That's kind of arrogant and self-entitled to think that way, don't you think? The same rays that have traveled 93 million miles have to spread across a greater area, meaning less energy per square mile. No matter how big the sun is, the rays have to spread across a larger surface area if the Earth is tilted away.
Number 9. Many flat earthers refer to the body of scientific knowledge as scientism. This is meant to be derogatory, implying that science is a religion. I'm very sorry, but saying this just demonstrates that you know nothing about science and probably didn't pass a single science class in high school. Science students are not told what to believe. They are shown how to perform experiments. Even in high school physics, students use blocks and ramps and balls and pendulums and carts and rulers and timers to derive Newton's laws and many other such pillars of science. So using the word scientism only serves to disqualify you from adult conversation regarding science. In actuality, it is quite clear why you adopt this viewpoint, because you just accept whatever you hear if it's what you want to believe. This is why your beliefs are baseless. Since you are incapable of doing anything other than repeating what you were told, you assume that others are doing the same thing, but they are not.
Scientism is simply another way of saying pseudoscience. For example, when you claim that bodies of water can curve around, stick to objects, and display the shape of said objects upon their surface, like the alleged ball Earth under your alleged curved oceans, but cannot give a single demonstrable example on a scale small enough to recreate, that is called scientism, or pseudoscience. Likewise, when you claim that opposing pressure systems can exist side by side without a solid barrier between them, but cannot provide a single evidential example of this claim, you are spouting more scientism.
First of all, no, Eric, they are not the same. Pseudoscience is defined as science outside the scientific method, whereas scientism is a word that you idiots made up. Second of all, both of your examples are just you saying, I can't observe it, you can't demonstrate it, therefore it's pseudoscience. What you're choosing willfully to ignore is the science behind our arguments. I know this will go over your tiny head, Eric, but spectroscopy is basically the science behind stuff we can't directly observe, something you and your sheep refuse to understand. Point being, just because we can't demonstrate it, or just because you can't observe it, doesn't mean it's pseudoscience.
And to wrap things up, number 10, the pièce de résistance, the claim that we have all been indoctrinated, that we have been brainwashed by schools, by the government, by NASA, by Freemasons, by Hollywood, take your pick. Well, as I have demonstrated in this clip, you all say the same exact ridiculous things word for word, like you're reciting the oath of the Flat Earth fraternity. So it's a rather silly accusation to be throwing around. The fact that you all say the same things is not surprising in the slightest. What do you do when you want to brainwash someone? You tell them they have already been brainwashed.
Yes, globe earthers say flat earthers have been brainwashed, and flat earthers say globe earthers have been brainwashed.
Yes, but only one of them has science and objective reality on their side. Hint, it's not flat Earth.
Think about this. Globe earthers are simply advocating the first version of reality they were taught as little children. Meanwhile, all flat earthers were actually taught that exact same version of reality as children. The only difference being that they went back as adults and did their due diligence in researching the opposing arguments without any bias or cognitive dissonance to see whether or not what they were taught as children still stood up to the critical scrutiny of a discerning adult.
No, the only difference is that you failed high school science. You didn't go back as adults and research the opposing side without any bias or cognitive dissonance and find flaws in the model. You spent hours watching flat Earth videos and looking at flat Earth memes and decided that they are right, and all our thousands of years of scientific progress, scientific research, millions of scientists, millions of professors, all space agencies, and all governments are wrong. That's not doing research, Eric. That is a perfect example of indoctrination. This also brings me back to something you said in point number 8, claiming that you're used to thinking for yourselves and allowing others to think for themselves. No, you are not. You have a loose group of delusional narcissists who blindly accept anything you spoon-feed them and pat themselves on the back pretending to have some kind of secret knowledge. You are giving yourself and your sheep way too much credit.
Then, after doing so, and finding fatal flaws in the model, these discerning adults went against all of society, enduring endless insults and ridicule, many losing friends and family members in the process, all for daring to question this globe gospel. So tell me, Professor, who sounds more brainwashed? The diligent and discerning adults able to override their initial bias and cognitive dissonance enough to research and reach a completely opposite understanding of that which was first taught to them? Or those who simply continued believing what they were originally taught as children?
Well, I guess those who continued to believe what they thought as children, but let's see. But I think that's more applicable to Christianity, because every kid is taught the heliocentric model in school, and a lot of kids like myself were taught Christianity growing up. But the difference between the two is that despite your incredulity, there's plenty of proof to support the globe model, whereas there's no proof to support Christian belief. They teach the heliocentric model in school because it's the only model that really works and explains everything. In terms of flat Earth, what exactly are they supposed to teach, Eric? Flat Earth doesn't have a working map or model to teach. So schools aren't there to indoctrinate kids, so they're there to educate kids about stuff that we know to be true. The globe Earth is known to be true. Indoctrination is what you're doing here. You're pushing your subjective beliefs on gullible people who'd fall for anything. Education and indoctrination are not the same thing. Before I end, I just have a question for you or any of your followers who may find their way into my comment section. And this is one that I doubt any flat earther can ever answer honestly. What sounds more like indoctrination? Somebody getting into an expensive university and learning science very few can understand, graduating and making a successful career out of it? Or someone suddenly changing their entire worldview because they watched a few videos made by con men? And I think that's a fair question, because you and your sheep love to go on about how billions of people have somehow been brainwashed by schools, NASA, Hollywood, governments, or Freemasons, but can never even consider for 1 second that maybe, just maybe, you have been indoctrinated by internet charlatans who lie for a living, who lie for money and status. So, was this a successful debunk? No. This wasn't even a debunk. This was just Eric clarifying that these are indeed the 10 things all flat earthers say. Again, note how he kept talking without ever addressing any of Dave's points, cutting parts out where Dave explains what he is talking about, and regurgitating the original points that Dave already debunked. Probably because Dave's claims were rock solid, and he was too embarrassed to admit that he has no rebuttal to any of them whatsoever. Probably would have been better if he didn't even touch the video if the claims were so rock solid. Also note how on the thumbnail he writes 10 things no flat earthers say, but throughout the video he repeats the 10 things all flat earthers say. Intellectual dishonesty at its best. This debunk attempt was so unbelievably lazy and pathetic that it's now very clear that he doesn't actually believe the crap he vomits onto YouTube. He just wants his brain-dead followers to think that he believes the crap he vomits onto YouTube because he is, what, ladies and gentlemen? A con man. He lies on the internet for money and status. So there is no way anyone with a brain would think that this is a debunk. He is not qualified in any way, shape, or form to debunk any aspect of the globe model, and he knows it. Every time any of his sheep try to debunk the globe model, they do it by regurgitating the same BS he spoon-feeds to them. But whenever they try, they demonstrate that they have no idea how the globe model works, making a total fool out of themselves. But why do we need these debunks if he doesn't actually believe what he is saying? So people know that he is a con man and don't fall for his science-illiterate propaganda. That's his only objective, is to prey on the gullible. The information he spreads is very problematic and needs to be addressed. Literally all of his videos, including his 200 proofs Earth is not a spinning ball, are filled with deception, blatant lies, laziness, cherry-picking, citation-free claims, intellectual dishonesty, willful ignorance, and citation-free and stupid memes that fail to understand basic science. It honestly blows my mind that he has 115,000 subscribers. And what's equally as mind-blowing is that 115,000 people are that pathetic. All his videos do is demonstrate how stupid and ignorant he is. And what's just as sad is that all of his viewers appear to be equally as stupid and ignorant as he is. Thanks for watching.